Hello there, I'm Kay, and welcome back to True Asian Nightmare. If you're lying there unable to sleep, or if the stress of today just refuses to leave your mind, I'm glad you found your way here. You don't have to force yourself to sleep just yet. Just rest your eyes, let out the tension, and allow me to sit beside you in the dark. If you enjoy unwinding with these true scary stories, hitting that like button and subscribing with the bell turned on really helps the channel. And it guarantees there will always be another nightmare waiting for you every other night. Just before we let the stories unfold, it would be amazing to hear what part of the world you're in and what time it says on your clock. It's always beautiful to realize we might be experiencing the very same late-night stillness together, no matter the distance. Now, get as cozy as possible, let the room fade to black, and let's dive into tonight's first chilling encounter. I need to take you back to the 90s for this one, to a small rural area in northern Vietnam, just a few dozen miles away from the big city of Hanoi. The medical setup back then was pretty rough and incredibly underfunded. If you had anything life-threatening, it meant a long, miserable, bumpy drive to the capital in whatever vehicle you could scrape together, while the local folks just relied on these small, run-down provincial clinics for everyday stuff. I had just been appointed as the head of the maternity clinic in the area. Now, you have to understand my background to get why I am the way I am. I'm a hardcore war veteran. I spent my youth patching up blown-apart soldiers on the front lines in conditions you couldn't even begin to imagine. Because of that, I was the absolute last person on Earth who'd entertain any of the paranormal crap that the nurses always gossiped about. I always told them that after surviving an actual war and holding dying men in my arms, ghosts were the absolute least of my damn problems. I was a woman of science, of flesh and blood, and I firmly believed that the only monsters out there were the living, breathing ones. But, heaven help me, working in that clinic completely shattered that mindset. To really set the scene for you, our maternity ward wasn't some sterile, bright, modern hospital. It was a single-story concrete building that always smelled intensely of cheap iodine, rusted metal, and damp earth. The electricity was barely reliable, so at night, the hallways were just bathed in this sickly, flickering yellow light from these weak incandescent bulbs to save money. And the quiet at night was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of thick, oppressive silence where you could hear the rusty ceiling fans squeaking and the distant, muffled groans of women in labor echoing down the drafty corridors. I had been working there for about a month when this particular incident happened. It was probably past 9:30 p.m. or something, and I was sitting at my desk doing paperwork. My office window looked right out over the security guard's booth and the muddy parking lot. That's when I heard this awful, desperate wailing coming from outside. I looked up and saw the orderlies rushing a pregnant woman inside on a squeaky stretcher. Now, as the head of the department, I didn't handle the standard intakes. I usually just let the triage nurses do their jobs and only stepped in if things went sideways or if it was a high-risk delivery. So I just sat there, watching them wheel her past my open door. She was screaming in absolute agony, just writhing on the thin mattress. Let's call her Willow. But what really made my blood boil wasn't her screaming. It was her husband. Let's call him Hunter. Hunter was jogging alongside the stretcher, completely ignoring his wife's obvious pain, and he just kept leaning over her, aggressively muttering at her to push out a boy. He kept repeating it, like some sick mantra, telling her she had to give him a son, that she better not mess this up and give him a girl. He was practically hissing it into her ear while she was tearing her own hair out in pain. It was just gross. It made my stomach tie into absolute knots. I mean, it was the late 90s, for crying out loud, and this guy was still acting like a medieval king, demanding an heir. I immediately called one of the junior nurses over and asked her if this couple had ever come in for their regular checkups at our clinic before. When she confirmed that they had, I demanded to see Willow's prenatal file. When she handed it to me, I flipped through the faded ultrasound reports. Now, I've been looking at these things for decades, and even with the grainy, crappy tech we had back then, I could read the signs. I knew immediately, with a very high degree of certainty, that she was carrying a girl. I just sighed and tossed the folder back on my desk, feeling this heavy, sinking pity for that poor young woman. I knew exactly what was going to happen. Society back then, and honestly, sometimes even now, could be incredibly cruel. I knew she was going to wake up exhausted and in pain, only to be verbally abused by her husband and her in-laws for doing something completely out of her control. About 45 minutes later, things went completely off the rails. One of the nurses came sprinting into my office, totally out of breath, telling me that Willow's water had broken, but the amniotic fluid was draining out way too fast and her cervix wasn't dilating at all. It was an absolute emergency. If we didn't cut the baby out right then and there, both of them were going to suffocate and die. I immediately threw on my scrubs and rushed down the hall to the operating room. As I was scrubbing in, Hunter actually had the nerve to grab my arm at the door. He literally clasped his hands together and begged me to somehow make sure the baby was a boy. He told me he was pleading with me to pull a son out of his wife. I was so pissed off I could barely see straight. I forcefully yanked my arm away from him and snapped that I was a medical doctor, not some miracle worker who could magically change a fetus's gender in the womb, and shoved my way into the OR. The surgery took about a grueling hour. We managed to stabilize Willow and pull the baby out safely. And, of course, it was a beautiful, healthy baby girl. We cleaned her up, did the skin-to-skin contact with the mother, who was completely out of it from the heavy anesthetics, and wrapped the baby in one of those standard scratchy pink hospital blankets. As I was standing at the sink, vigorously scrubbing the blood and fluids off my hands up to my elbows, I told one of the nurses to go out to the waiting area and give the husband the stats, time of birth, weight, and the gender. I finished washing up, dried my hands, and walked out of the OR, maybe 2 minutes later. And I swear to you, I watched it happen with my own 2 eyes. Hunter had been sitting there with these 2 heavy woven bags full of food and clothes for the hospital stay. When the nurse told him he had a daughter, he didn't say a single word. He just stood up, grabbed his bags in both hands, turned his back on the delivery room, and power walked straight out the front doors of the clinic. He marched into the parking lot, hopped on his motorbike, and sped off into the night without looking back once. I was absolutely speechless. I stood there staring at the empty double doors, my brain just completely short-circuiting. In all my years of delivering babies, I had seen disappointed fathers, sure, but I had never, ever seen a man physically abandon his freshly sliced open wife and newborn baby before the anesthetic even wore off. It was just pure, unadulterated garbage behavior. Later that night, the nurses filled me in on the gossip they had extracted from Hunter before the delivery. Apparently, his family was dirt poor originally, but his parents owned several massive, highly valuable plots of land right in the center of Hanoi. They were wealthy now, but they were viciously old-fashioned. They had this strict family rule that only male heirs would be written into the family registry, and more importantly, only male heirs would be included in the inheritance will. To them, a daughter was just a temporary burden, a wild duck that would eventually fly away, marry into another family, and take their hard-earned dowry money with her. Hunter had been terrified of being cut off from the family fortune, so he had basically pinned his entire financial future on his wife's uterus. I was disgusted, but there was nothing I could do. I went back to my office to rest, hoping things would just sort themselves out in the morning. But I didn't know that my own staff was about to make a horrible situation completely fatal. You see, Hunter had fled without paying a single dime of the hospital admission fees. He hadn't even left a deposit. So, a few hours later, when Willow finally woke up in the recovery ward, she was in agony from the surgical incision. The nurse on duty, let's call her Nova, was one of those bitter, burnt-out types who cared more about protocol than human life. Nova walked up to Willow's bed and demanded the rest of the cash before she would administer any painkillers or antibiotics. Willow was sobbing, completely hysterical, pleading with Nova through indirect tears that her husband had abandoned her because she had a girl, and begging for them to just give her the medicine on credit until the morning when her in-laws might come to pay. Instead of showing even an ounce of basic human empathy, Nova leaned over her and unleashed the most vile, venomous rant you could imagine. Nova told her that if she was too damn broke to afford the fees, she shouldn't have spread her legs and gotten knocked up in the first place. She berated her, saying that the hospital wasn't a charity and that it was entirely Willow's fault her husband was a deadbeat who didn't want her, and that she wasn't going to stick her neck out and lose her job over some penniless abandoned wife. Willow just lay there and took it. She was completely broken. Her husband hated her. Her child was a financial death sentence, and now she was being publicly humiliated and denied basic medical relief. A few hours later, when the ward was dead silent and the nurses were all dozing off at the station, Willow somehow managed to force herself out of bed. I still don't know how she did it, considering she had just had her abdomen sliced open hours prior. The pain must have been blinding. But she picked up her sleeping baby girl, walked out to the open-air balcony on the first floor, and simply leaned forward. I was jolted awake in my office by this horrific, blood-curdling scream from the courtyard. I sprinted out of my room and pushed my way through the crowd of terrified patients and orderlies that had gathered outside. It was a massacre. The baby, she was so small, only hours old, she had died instantly on impact. But Willow was still alive. Because it was only a one-story drop, it wasn't enough to end it quickly. She was sprawled out on the cold concrete, her surgical wounds completely torn open, and she was making these wet, suffocating, gurgling sounds as she aspirated on her own blood. We scrambled desperately to save her. We managed to haul her onto a stretcher and shoved her into an ambulance to transfer her to a major trauma hospital. But the paramedics later told me she flatlined before the ambulance even backed out of the driveway. I was furious. I did an internal investigation, found out what Nova had said to her, and I had that cruel nurse immediately fired and blacklisted from our district. But the damage was done. 2 lives were gone, completely wasted. And then, exactly 1 year passed, and this is the part where my entire understanding of reality just broke down. It was the exact same time of year, and I was pulling another lonely night shift. It was an incredibly slow night. We didn't have a single emergency intake, and the ward was just dead quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of the ancient refrigerator in the break room, and the occasional patter of light rain against the glass panes. Around maybe 1:45 a.m., I had folded up my paperwork and was lying down on the small cot in my office, trying to get some sleep. Suddenly, I heard this frantic, violent pounding on my office door. It was so loud it rattled the glass in the frame. I startled awake, my heart immediately hammering against my ribs. I looked toward the door. It was a glass-pane door, but it was dark out in the hall. Standing on the other side of the glass was a woman. I couldn't make out her face because her hair was a tangled, matted mess hanging down over her eyes, but I could see her clothes. She was wearing one of our standard-issue maternity gowns, and the entire abdominal area was stained dark with dried, crusty blood. I thought maybe she was a post-op patient who had wandered off and popped her stitches. I scrambled off the cot and practically threw the door open, asking her what the hell was wrong. She was completely panicked, her voice trembling and breathless. "Doctor, please, you have to come check on my baby. She's turning blue. She's not breathing. Please come look at her. She's in room 2, bed 3. Please." My doctor instincts completely took over. I didn't even process the weirdness of it. I told her I was coming, turned my back to her for maybe 2 seconds to snatch my white coat off the chair and shove my glasses onto my face. But when I turned back around, the doorway was completely empty. I stood there, blinking into the dark, quiet corridor. There was no sound of running footsteps, no squeaky slippers on the linoleum, nothing. Just absolute silence. My brain immediately went into overdrive, desperately trying to construct a logical excuse. I told myself she must have just sprinted back up the stairs in a panic. I mean, humans don't just vaporize into thin air, right? So I jogged out of my office and took the stairs 2 at a time, rushing all the way up to the 2nd floor. I sprinted down the hall and burst through the door of room 2, making a beeline straight for bed number 3. I yanked the privacy curtain back, totally out of breath, asking what was wrong with the baby. The woman in the bed gasped and sat up, clutching her newborn to her chest. The baby was perfectly fine, crying softly because I had just scared the crap out of them. The mother looked at me like I was an absolute lunatic. I asked her why she ran down to my office to tell me her baby was turning blue. She just stared at me, totally bewildered, and said she had been in this bed since yesterday afternoon and hadn't stepped foot out of the room. The commotion drew the attention of the night nurses, who all came rushing in. When I demanded to know which post-op C-section patient had just run down to my office, the head nurse looked at me with this deeply confused expression and told me that we hadn't had a single surgical delivery all week. Every baby in the ward was perfectly healthy. I felt my face burn with embarrassment. There were about 10 patients in that room, all staring at the strict, no-nonsense head doctor acting like she was losing her damn mind. I mumbled an apology, blaming it on sleep deprivation, and quickly shuffled out of the room. I was so incredibly frustrated with myself as I walked back down the stairs. I was trying to convince myself that I had just fallen asleep at my desk and experienced a hyper-realistic lucid dream. That was it, just an auditory hallucination from stress. But as I approached my office down that dark, isolated corridor, my stomach suddenly dropped out from under me. My office door was pushed open about a hand's width, and coming from the pitch-black darkness inside my own room, I could hear a woman crying. It wasn't a loud wail. It was a miserable, suffocating, wet sobbing. And then, I heard her speaking in this thick, agonizing northern dialect. "Oh, my baby, we are so miserable. If only you were a boy, we wouldn't have to suffer like this. Why did you have to be a girl?" Every single hair on my arms stood straight up. The air in the hallway suddenly felt freezing cold and incredibly heavy, like I was trying to breathe underwater. My logical brain was screaming at me to run, to go get the security guard, but someone was in my room. I slowly pushed the door open, the hinges whining slightly in the quiet. The room was almost entirely dark, since I hadn't turned the overhead light on earlier, but sitting right there, on the edge of my personal cot, was the woman. She was cradling a small bundle in her arms, gently rocking it back and forth. I was terrified, but I also felt this flash of anger. This was my private office. I took a tentative step inside, my voice shaking a little as I told her she was in the wrong room and needed to go back to the recovery ward. She didn't look at me. She just kept sobbing and repeating those same miserable words over and over again. As I stepped closer, my eyes finally adjusted to the gloom, and my professional instinct automatically drew my gaze down to the baby she was holding. The baby was wrapped tightly in one of our hospital's pink towels, but something was horribly, fundamentally wrong with it. I squinted in the low light, leaning in slightly, and then my entire body just locked up in absolute paralysis. The baby's head, it looked like a dropped melon. The skull was completely caved in on the left side, grossly asymmetrical and unnatural. The little nose was entirely flattened and pushed completely to the side of her cheek, and her jaw hung totally slack, unhinged. Dark, thick blood was just continuously welling out of the crushed tissue, completely soaking the pink towel in her mother's arms, dripping down onto my bed sheets. It was the exact, localized physical trauma of a high-velocity impact against solid concrete, and in that moment of sheer, primal panic, my brain completely snapped. I didn't even fully process the impossible horror of what I was looking at. All I knew was that there was a critically injured infant right in front of me. I let out this guttural, terrified yell, screaming out loud, asking what the hell had happened to the baby, and frantically demanding her to hand the poor thing over to me immediately. I lunged forward, with both of my hands outstretched, to snatch the baby away from her to start resuscitation. But the exact millisecond my fingers brushed against the fabric of that pink towel. Fuck. There was a sharp, localized drop in air pressure, and with a sickening pop, both the mother and the mangled baby vanished completely into thin air. Because I had lunged forward with all my weight, my momentum carried me forward, and I crashed face first, straight into the empty mattress. I just lay there for a second, my heart hammering so violently against my ribcage I honestly thought I was having a myocardial infarction. The room was dead silent again. The bed was empty. There was no blood. There was no woman. I scrambled backward off the bed, my legs completely tangled in my own coat, and frantically slapped the wall switch to turn on the harsh fluorescent overhead lights. The room was completely normal, empty. I stumbled backward until my hips hit the edge of my wooden desk, and I just slumped down into my desk chair, taking these huge, ragged gasps of air, clutching my chest. Look, I know how this sounds. You're probably sitting there thinking I was just sleep deprived and hallucinating, and trust me, I was sitting there in my chair, desperately trying to tell myself the exact same thing. I was literally whispering out loud that I was just losing my mind from exhaustion. But then, I looked down. Sitting perfectly centered on my desk pad, directly under the harsh glare of my desk lamp, was a manila medical file. It hadn't been there when I went to sleep. My desk had been completely clear. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grasp the cardboard cover, but I slowly flipped it open. I didn't recognize the name at first, but my eyes immediately dragged themselves down to the discharge notes scribbled at the bottom of the page. Patient deceased on premises. Cause of death: massive internal trauma resulting from a suicide jump from the first-floor balcony. Infant daughter deceased on impact. When I opened that file and saw those notes about the suicide, I checked the date at the top of the page, and my blood ran absolutely cold. It was the exact 1-year anniversary on the lunar calendar, which is how we track death anniversaries in our culture. The very next afternoon, before my shift started, I quietly asked one of my trusted nurses to prepare a simple tray of food and fresh fruit. I took it out to the courtyard, to the exact patch of concrete where the mother and baby had hit the ground, and I lit some incense for them. I never told the staff what I saw in my office that night, but I've kept up that silent ritual every single year since. It just breaks my heart, you know. It still makes my stomach turn thinking that all this unfathomable horror, all this lingering trauma, stemmed from one stupid, arrogant family's rule that boys matter and girls don't. And despite all of that, I never quit. I'm actually still working as a doctor to this day. So, I married a Korean guy way back in the day. Like, we're talking over a decade ago, when I was just in my early 20s. By the time this happened, I was on my 3rd kid, and let me tell you, the stress was absolutely eating me alive. My husband was going through some rough patches with his business. I was already exhausted from chasing 2 toddlers around, and because of all that anxiety, my milk just completely dried up. But the one saving grace was that my in-laws really took care of me, and they put me in this super VIP maternity hospital over in South Korea that felt more like a luxury hotel. Honestly, it felt like I was going on some kind of relaxing vacation instead of recovering from childbirth. Since I couldn't nurse, my mother-in-law signed me up for this night feeding service they had, where every 3 hours, like exactly at midnight, 3 a.m., and so on, a nurse would come take the baby to give them formula so I could get some actual sleep. And honestly, you really have to picture this place to understand how secure I felt, because it wasn't just a normal clinical hospital room with those depressing fluorescent lights and a roommate groaning next to you behind a thin curtain. No, this was basically a high-end penthouse suite. It was massive, with this huge plush leather sofa over by the window where my mother-in-law would crash, a massive flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, and heavy, thick soundproof doors. It was the kind of place that cost thousands of bucks a night. The kind of place where you expect absolute privacy and zero weirdness. I had delivered my first 2 kids in this exact same room. I actually requested it specifically because I liked the layout so much, so I felt completely comfortable there. It was my safe zone, you know? Having a C-section for your 3rd kid is an entirely different level of physical misery, though. Your body is just done. Every single time I had to shift my weight on that adjustable hospital bed, it felt like someone was dragging a serrated knife across my lower abdomen, and the sheer exhaustion of it all just leaves you in this weird, loopy state of mind. You don't have a normal sleep schedule anymore. You just exist in these short, painful bursts of consciousness between painkillers. The routine for the night feeding was actually really specific, and it worked like clockwork. Newborns don't have a biological clock. They don't care if it's broad daylight or the dead of night. They just wake up screaming when they're hungry. So we set up the 3-hour interval. At exactly midnight, the night nurse would come in, quietly scoop up the baby from the bassinet next to my bed, and take them down the hall to the nursery to give them a bottle of formula. She told me it usually took about 30 minutes to feed and burp the baby. When she brought the baby back, she wouldn't just barge in. The protocol was that she would knock on the door exactly 3 times. Always 3 distinct knocks. That was my cue. I would force myself to sit up, reach over and turn off the main room lights so the sudden brightness wouldn't startle the baby awake, and then I'd shuffle over in the dark, open the door, and let her in. The nurse would walk quietly through the pitch-black room, gently place the sleeping baby back into the bassinet, and slip out without us having to exchange a single word. It was a completely silent routine, designed to keep everyone asleep. So, on the second night of my stay, things started out exactly like that. My husband had gone back to our house to deal with some work stuff and check on the older kids, so it was just me, the baby, and my mother-in-law, who was already dead to the world, snoring softly on that big leather sofa on the other side of the room. Midnight rolled around, and right on schedule, the nurse came in. We left the dim lights on. She smiled, picked up my baby, and whispered that she'd be back in about half an hour. She walked out, the heavy door clicked shut behind her, and the room got insanely quiet, with that thick, heavy silence you only ever get in hospitals late at night. I couldn't fall back asleep right away because my incision was throbbing, so I grabbed the remote and turned on the TV. I had lived there long enough to be pretty fluent, so I didn't even need subtitles, and I just started flipping through channels, eventually settling on some random K-pop music show and a generic late-night drama. I was just letting the bright, flashy colors from the screen wash over the dark room, trying to distract my brain from the burning sensation in my stomach, when all of a sudden, I heard this very deliberate sound, just 3 sharp, distinct thuds echoing against the thick wood of my door. I remember staring at the door for a second, totally confused, because I immediately glanced down at the digital clock on the cable box underneath the TV, and it clearly read 12:16 a.m. I thought to myself, there is absolutely no freaking way a newborn finishes a bottle, gets burped, and falls back asleep in 16 minutes. It was way too fast. But, you know, mom brain kicks in, and I figured maybe the baby just refused the bottle or was throwing a fit and the nurse needed me to calm them down. So, groaning and holding my stomach to keep my stitches from pulling, I swung my legs over the side of the bed. I did the routine. I grabbed the remote, shut off the TV so the room was pitch black, reached over to switch off the bedside lamp, and slowly shuffled my way across the cold floor toward the door. I grabbed the heavy metal handle, pulled the door open, and stepped back to let the nurse in. Except, there was no nurse. Standing right there in the brightly lit hallway was this woman, and I don't mean a doctor, or another patient in a gown or a janitor. It was a grown woman, and her face was completely, unnaturally pale, like she had literally taken a cheap tub of skin bleaching cream and smeared it an inch thick across every inch of her skin. It was chalky and weird, but the thing that really threw me off, the thing that made my brain just completely short-circuit, was that she was wearing a hanbok, like a full traditional, heavily embroidered Korean national dress. The kind of massive bell-shaped gown you only ever wear to formal weddings or major traditional holidays. I just stood there in the doorway, barefoot in the dark, staring out at her in the bright hallway, completely stunned. We just looked at each other in total silence for what felt like an eternity, probably only 5 seconds, but it felt so long, and I was just trying to process why the hell someone was walking around a VIP maternity ward at midnight dressed like they were going to a historical parade. Then, she blinked, looked at me with this totally blank expression, and said in a very casual, almost polite Korean voice, "Oh, I'm sorry, I have the wrong room." She didn't wait for me to reply. She just turned around, I was so taken aback that I didn't even say anything. I just awkwardly scratched my head, muttered something under my breath about people being crazy, and slowly pulled the door shut. I locked it, waddled back to my bed, climbed under the covers, and grabbed the remote to turn the TV back on. My mind was just spinning, trying to rationalize it. I kept telling myself that maybe someone's eccentric grandmother had come to visit a new baby down the hall and got lost. But even then, who the hell wears a giant restrictive traditional gown to a hospital in the middle of the night? It was so weird, but I was so tired I just chalked it up to sleep deprivation and tried to focus on the TV screen. A few minutes went by. I was just starting to relax my muscles again when the sound cut through the room a second time. 3 more sharp, heavy thuds against the wood of the door. I looked at the clock again. It was 12:20 a.m. Now I was getting a little annoyed. I figured, okay, maybe it actually is the nurse this time, or maybe that crazy lady in the dress got turned around again. I hit the power button on the TV, plunging the room into darkness once more, held my aching stomach, and marched back over to the door. I swung it open, fully expecting to see the nurse in her scrubs. But nope, it was her again, the exact same woman in the handbok. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't just standing there looking confused. The second the door opened, she immediately locked eyes with me and smiled. And when she smiled, I noticed her lips were painted this grotesque, vibrant shade of crimson red that stood out so sharply against her chalky white face it actually made my stomach drop. She tilted her head to the side, her eyes crinkling up into these thin little slits, and she just stared at me with this sickeningly sweet, almost mocking expression. "I have the wrong room," she said again, but this time her voice was totally different. It wasn't apologetic anymore. It sounded amused, like she thought this was some kind of hilarious inside joke that only she understood. Before I could even open my mouth to ask her what her freaking problem was, she turned away and started walking down the hall. And as she walked, my brain struggled to comprehend what I was seeing, because the skirt of a hanbok is incredibly wide and long. It sweeps the floor, right? But the way she was moving, she was bobbing up and down in this unnatural, jerky, almost spring-like motion, dipping and rising with every step. But looking down at the hem of her massive dress, I couldn't see any feet. There were no shoes, no footsteps on the linoleum. Just this giant mound of fabric floating and bobbing away from me down the sterile corridor. A cold shiver shot straight up my spine. I slammed the door shut so hard it rattled the frame, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. I told myself she was just some mentally unwell patient, maybe someone from the psychiatric wing who wandered off, and her feet were just hidden under the fabric. You know how your brain desperately tries to build a logical bridge when you see something terrifying? That's what I was doing. I was gaslighting myself. I scrambled back into bed, pulled the blankets up to my chin, and cranked the volume on the TV just to drown out the silence, absolutely terrified that I was going to hear that knocking again. And then, a few minutes later, the silence was completely shattered when I heard those 3 deliberate, heavy thuds against the wood of my door again, making me practically jump out of my skin as I whipped my head toward the clock. 12:27 a.m. Almost 30 minutes had passed since the baby was taken. That was the exact time the nurse said she would be back. But my nerves were completely shot. There was no way in hell I was just blindly throwing that door open again for that creepy woman in the dress. I forced myself out of bed, crept across the dark room, and instead of reaching for the handle, I pressed my eye right up against the little glass peephole in the center of the door. I held my breath and peered out into the distorted fisheye view of the hallway, and I let out a massive trembling sigh of relief. Through the curved glass, I could clearly see the familiar blue scrubs of the night nurse. She was standing there, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a hospital blanket, her head bowed down slightly, as if she was looking at the sleeping baby in her arms. It was her. Thank God, it was just the nurse. All the tension instantly drained out of my shoulders. I felt so stupid for being so paranoid. I reached over, flicked off the main light switch by the door to keep the room dark for the baby, and then slowly pulled the door open. Because I had already verified it was the nurse through the peephole, And because I was so desperate to just get back to bed before the pain in my stomach flared up again, I didn't even bother looking at her. I didn't check. I just opened the door wide, turned my back to the hallway, and immediately started walking back toward my bed. I expected her to just silently follow me in, put the baby in the bassinet, and leave, just like the protocol demanded. But as I was taking those slow, agonizing steps in the pitch-black room, my bare feet padding softly against the floor, I heard something right behind me. It wasn't the soft, rubber-soled squeak of a nurse's walking shoes. It was the heavy, rustling drag of thick fabric. Swish, drag, swish, drag. And it was close. It was right on my heels. I could almost feel the displacement of air against my back. It felt like the person carrying my baby was practically breathing down my neck. I didn't stop, though. I just kept my eyes locked on the edge of my mattress, gritting my teeth against the pain in my incision, and finally, I reached the bed. I carefully climbed up, gripping the sheets, and slowly lowered my weight down onto the mattress. The moment my backside hit the bed, I let out a breath, and I turned my upper body around, expecting to see the nurse standing by the bassinet gently lowering my child down. But there was no nurse. There was no baby. Standing right there, less than 2 feet away from the edge of my bed, towering over me in the darkness of my room, was the woman in the hanbok. The white face, the red lips, the dead, staring eyes. She was inside. She was right beside me. And before my brain could even completely snap from the absolute nightmare of what I was looking at, before I could even draw breath to scream for my mother-in-law, the woman lunged. She didn't just reach for me. She threw her entire body forward, her arms snapping out, and she violently shoved my shoulders backward. I hit the mattress hard, the breath completely knocked out of my lungs, and in the next split second, she scrambled up onto the bed and dropped her entire weight directly onto my stomach. It wasn't a ghostly, ethereal chill. It was heavy. It was a solid, crushing mass of physical weight dropping like a boulder straight down onto my freshly sliced, barely stitched abdomen. I let out this horrific, gargling shriek because the pain was so sudden and so blindingly intense it felt like a bomb had gone off inside my pelvis. It was just pure, unadulterated fucking agony. I could literally feel the skin of my stomach stretching and ripping under her weight. At the same time, the massive, heavy layers of her traditional dress collapsed forward, completely smothering my face. It smelled like old dust and rotting fabric, blocking out all the air in the room, pressing into my mouth and nose so I couldn't even scream anymore. I was trapped under her, thrashing blindly, the white-hot pain from my C-section shooting up my spine and frying every nerve ending in my body. I tried to push her off. I tried to buck my hips, but she felt like she weighed 300 pounds, just grinding down into my open wound. The pain was too much. It was just too much. I only managed to fight for maybe 5 or 6 seconds before the darkness at the edges of my vision rapidly closed in, my brain simply shutting off to escape the torture, and I completely blacked out. I don't know how long I was out. When I finally dragged my eyes open, the room was blindingly bright. The main overhead lights were on. I was gasping for air, clutching my stomach in a cold sweat, wildly looking around for the woman in the dress. But she was gone. Instead, my mother-in-law was standing right next to my bed, looking down at me with this extremely irritated expression, and just behind her stood the actual night nurse, looking incredibly awkward while rocking my baby in her arms. My mother-in-law started scolding me in Korean, her voice sharp and loud. She snapped at me, demanding to know what my problem was while pointing at the door. She completely went off on me, complaining that the poor nurse had been standing out in the freezing cold hallway holding her grandson, just knocking and banging for 5 minutes straight. She grumbled about how she had to wake up and drag herself over to let the nurse in because I was just sitting there ignoring them. I just stared at her, my mouth opening and closing like a fish. The nurse had been locked out? If the nurse was out there banging on the door, then who the hell did I let in? Who did I see through the peephole? I started hyperventilating, the realization crashing over me like a tidal wave. I didn't even try to explain the ghost right then, because my mind was completely shattered. I just grabbed my mother-in-law's arm, my hands trembling uncontrollably, and begged her, absolutely pleaded with her, not to turn off the lights. I told her I didn't care if it kept the baby awake. I didn't care about anything. I just needed the lights on. I spent the rest of that night huddled against the headboard, staring wide-eyed at the locked door, jumping at every single sound from the hallway, terrified that the handle was going to turn. The next morning, when we were finally in the car heading home, I just spilled everything to my husband and my mother-in-law. I was shaking the whole time, but my mother-in-law didn't even look that surprised, and she explained that in Korean folklore, when older women die, their spirits often manifest wearing those exact traditional hanbok dresses, kind of like how in the West, people always see ghosts in Victorian nightgowns. It made my blood run cold, but the absolute worst part was the physical damage. A few days later, I was in so much agony, I had to go back to the doctor, and it turned out the sheer weight of that thing sitting on me had literally popped my C-section stitches open, and they had to redo them. I told my husband right then and there, if we ever miraculously have a fourth kid, I am never, ever stepping foot in that hospital again. So, about 4 years back, I was pregnant with my first baby, and my doctor noticed my pelvic bone was kind of small, but he was dead set on me delivering naturally to avoid complications. Honestly, I should have known it was going to be a disaster when I checked into this big hospital on my due date, and my body just refused to go into labor. 6 hours of absolutely nothing happening, and the medical staff were just as confused as I was, so they hit me with this induction medication to force the whole process. And let me tell you, that was the moment everything just went completely off the rails. I don't know if any of you have ever had a bad reaction to medical drugs, but it just messes with your head so badly because you are trapped in a place that is supposed to heal you, surrounded by experts who suddenly look just as panicked as you feel. Almost immediately after they pushed that liquid into my IV, it wasn't just normal contraction pain. It was this agonizing, tearing sensation right in my gut. I remember lying there, clutching the thin hospital sheets, trying to gasp for air because my heart started doing these crazy acrobatics, beating out of my chest 1 second, and then slowing down so much I thought it was just going to stop the next. The nurses were hovering over me, checking the monitors, and my brain was just screaming at me that something was seriously messed up, but I couldn't even form the words. They kept checking my dilation, and despite the fact that I was writhing in this unspeakable agony, my water hadn't broken. There were zero actual signs of the baby coming. I was just suffering for absolutely nothing. Eventually, the doctor rushed in, took one look at my vitals dropping and spiking, and immediately called an audible. He told my husband that we couldn't wait anymore, that the natural birth was completely off the table, and they had to slice me open right that second. The panic in his voice, it just scared the crap out of me. Before I could even process what was happening, I was being wheeled down these blindingly bright hallways, staring up at those awful fluorescent lights passing by one. And then, I just blacked out. When I finally came to, I wasn't in a normal recovery room. I woke up to the rhythmic, synthetic beeping of machines and this heavy, suffocating smell of iodine and rubbing alcohol. I was in the intensive care unit. Apparently, during the emergency C-section, the combination of my horrific reaction to that induction drug and the massive blood loss from the surgery threw my body into severe shock. Right after they stitched me up, I started convulsing on the operating table. The doctors literally had to snatch my newborn son away, hand him off to my mom and my husband to take back to the regular room first, and throw me into the ICU just to keep me breathing. I spent 24 hours in that sterile, freezing room. 24 hours of just pure, non-stop pain, where the anesthesia was wearing off and every single breath felt like someone was dragging a serrated blade across my lower abdomen. But you know what hurt more than the physical pain? The absolute, crushing guilt. As a new mother, all you read about is how crucial that immediate skin-to-skin contact is, how you need to hold your baby the second they enter the world. and I was robbed of that. I lay there in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, crying silently because I genuinely thought my body was failing and I was going to die, without ever seeing my little boy's face. The nurses kept coming in, adjusting my IVs, telling me in that overly calm clinical voice that everything was fine, that it was just a standard postpartum complication. But when you are trapped in your own head, feeling your life force barely hanging on, you don't believe a word they say. It wasn't until the next afternoon that they finally deemed me stable enough to be moved to a regular postpartum VIP room. That was the first time I actually got to look at my son. It had been over a full day since he was cut out of me. My mom brought him over, and I was so beat up and exhausted, so incredibly weak, that I couldn't even lift my arms to hold him. I had to helplessly ask my mom to gently place him on my chest so I could just feel his body heat. I just lay there, completely paralyzed by exhaustion, tears streaming down my face, just staring at him. It was supposed to be this beautiful, magical moment, but all I felt was this lingering sense of dread, like my body was a hollowed-out shell. By the time the second night rolled around, my husband had to go home to grab some supplies and take care of a few things, so it was just my mom staying with me. I was feeling a tiny bit better. At least I could somewhat prop myself up if I ignored the burning fire in my stitches. The VIP room was spacious, designed for 2 patients, but the other bed was empty. My mom, knowing how utterly exhausted I was, didn't want the baby waking me up if he got fussy. So she rolled his little plastic hospital crib all the way over near the entrance of the room. She unfolded a canvas cot right next to it, essentially creating a barricade between the door and the crib, and settled in for the night. I don't know exactly what time it was, maybe 1:17 a.m. or something, but the hospital had gotten stupidly quiet, like that dead of night kind of quiet where the only thing you can hear is the low hum of the central AC. I was drifting in and out of this feverish, medicated sleep until I heard this weird, dragging sound out in the hallway, almost like the wet smack of rubber slippers dragging against the linoleum tiles, just going thwack, scuff, right outside, over and over again, completely cutting through the dead quiet. I opened my eyes, my vision a little blurry, and looked toward the door. The door to our room had this large rectangular window of frosted glass, meaning you couldn't see details, but if someone stood right outside, the hallway lights would cast their shadow against it. And there was a shadow. Someone was standing completely still, right outside our door. They just stood there for a really long time, maybe 30 seconds, not moving, not knocking. Then, very slowly, I saw the handle turn, the door clicked open, and a figure stepped inside. Now my brain immediately tried to rationalize this. During the day, the hospital staff had told us that because we were in the VIP wing, they provided complimentary newborn care, meaning night nurses would occasionally come in to change diapers, clean the umbilical cord, or even clear the baby's bowels so the mothers could rest. So, seeing someone walk in at 1 a.m., I just assumed it was a nurse doing her rounds. I didn't say anything. I just lay there, heavily medicated, watching her. She didn't even glance in my direction. She walked straight past the foot of my bed and went directly to the crib near the door where my son was sleeping. But as I kept watching her silhouette in the dim light, something felt intensely wrong. The way she was moving wasn't gentle. She reached both of her hands into the crib, and she started doing this aggressive, repetitive motion, almost like she was scrubbing a stubborn stain out of a thick piece of fabric, or violently washing dishes. She was digging her hands in and just mashing down, over and over again, completely erratic and rough. My stomach tied into absolute knots. I kept thinking, what the hell kind of nurse handles a 2-day-old infant like that? It was so aggressive that a few seconds later, I heard my newborn son let out this awful, sharp gasp, like the wind had been knocked out of him, followed by a frantic, breathless cry. That sound triggered something primal in me. I tried to throw myself up, to scream at her, but my body was literally dead weight. I managed to barely lift my head off the pillow, straining my vocal cords to call out for my mom, but all that came out was this pathetic, raspy whisper. I was trying to yell at this woman, demanding to know what the hell she was doing to my baby, but I couldn't project my voice at all. And right at that moment, the woman stopped. She slowly turned her head and looked directly at me across the dark room. I will never, ever forget that face as long as I live. It wasn't a normal human face. The skin was this sickly, ashen gray, almost like wet clay, and it had absolutely no defining characteristics of age. She wasn't young. She wasn't old. She was just wrong. But the worst part was her eyes. They were bulging, completely unblinking, just staring right through me with this intense, malicious emptiness. It was the kind of look that makes your blood run freezing cold. We locked eyes for a split second, and then she just turned around, walked out the door, and pulled it shut behind her, with a soft click. The second the door closed, the paralysis broke. I started thrashing against the bed rails, screaming for my mom as loud as my ruined body would let me. My mom jolted awake on her cot, totally disoriented, asking me what was wrong. I frantically told her that a nurse had just come in and handled the baby way too roughly, begging her to check on him. My mom was confused, arguing that no one had come in, that she had been sleeping right there against the door and would have felt it open. But I was hysterical, telling her I saw it with my own 2 eyes. She quickly turned on the harsh overhead lights and reached into the crib to pick up my crying son, and I swear to God, as she brought him over to me under the bright light, my heart completely stopped. My son was a healthy, chubby baby, his newborn skin all flushed and red, but right there, on the center of his cheek, was a distinct, deep indentation. It was perfectly round, about the size of an adult thumb knuckle, pressed so deeply into his flesh that the skin around it was completely pale white, devoid of any blood. It looked exactly like an invisible finger was still pressing down onto his face. My mom gasped, almost dropping him. She immediately ran out into the hallway, yelling for the nurses on duty. A whole group of them rushed in, looking panicked. But when my mom demanded to know which night nurse had just been in our room, they looked at us like we were crazy. They explicitly stated that unless there was a medical emergency, no staff member was scheduled to do routine baby checks at 1 a.m. Furthermore, the nurse's station was literally just 4 or 5 doors down the hall, with a clear line of sight to our room, and they all swore on their lives that absolutely no one had walked down that hallway. Being in a hospital, you are entirely at their mercy. You are just a patient, and they hold all the cards. We knew they weren't going to take responsibility, and arguing would just make them label me as a hysterical new mother. So feeling completely defeated and utterly terrified, my mom just brought the crib all the way back, wedging it tightly between my bed and the wall. She then dragged her canvas folding cot and positioned it right at the foot of my bed, creating a literal physical wall. If anyone, or anything, wanted to get to my kid, they would have to step over her first. Once the lights were turned back off, the room felt suffocating. I lay there, my adrenaline crashing, leaving me to deal with the agonizing throbbing of my surgical wound. Every single muscle in my body ached, and I felt so incredibly weak that keeping my eyes open was a physical struggle. Eventually, despite the sheer terror radiating through my veins, my exhaustion won out, and I slipped back into a shallow, uneasy sleep. I don't know how much time passed, but it happened again. I was barely dozing off when that exact same wet, dragging sound of rubber slippers started creeping down the hall again, accompanied by this metallic rattling of the crib's wheels, which immediately snapped me wide awake. I didn't even have to look toward the door. I shifted my gaze, and standing right there in the dim light, leaning over my sleeping mother's cot, was the exact same gray-faced woman, and she had her hands firmly gripped on my baby's crib, slowly dragging it away from my bed, pulling it toward the hallway door. I can't even begin to explain what happens to your brain when you see something trying to take your child. You stop thinking logically, and you don't even feel pain anymore. The fact that I had a massive, stapled incision across my stomach just didn't matter at all. I was completely running on this blind mom instinct, and I just launched myself out of that hospital bed. And the weirdest part, I felt nothing. No pulling of stitches, no weakness, no gravity. I sprung up with the agility of a perfectly healthy person, leaping over the gap and slamming my hands down onto the edge of the crib, aggressively jerking it out of her grip. I started screaming at the top of my lungs. I was demanding to know who the hell she was, swearing at her, screaming for my mom to wake up and help me. I was making an absolute scene, a chaotic, ear-splitting racket that should have woken up the entire wing of the hospital. But as I was screaming, I realized the room was dead silent. My mom was still breathing softly, fast asleep on the cot right beneath me. The empty bed next to us was completely undisturbed. Not a single person was reacting to my frantic shouting. I stood there, gripping the cold plastic of the crib, both of my bare feet planted firmly on the freezing tile floor. I could feel the chill of the ground seeping into my soles. I glared at the woman, aggressively telling her to back off, that I didn't need her services, that she needed to get the hell out of my room. The woman slowly stopped reaching for the crib. She stood up straight, her grotesque, clay-like face tilting slightly, and she locked those dead, bulging eyes onto mine. When she spoke, her voice didn't sound human. It was this high-pitched, vibrating, metallic screech that seemed to echo directly inside the center of my brain. "Take a good look at who was lying on that bed," she hissed, pointing a long, gray finger behind me. "Go back over there and lie down. You're dead now. You have been dead this whole time." My brain completely short-circuited. I didn't understand what she was saying. My hands were still gripping the crib. I could feel the plastic. I could feel the cold floor. I slowly turned my head, following the direction of her rotting finger, looking past my sleeping mother, toward my hospital bed, and my reality simply shattered. Lying there on the mattress, tangled in the white sheets, was me. It was my physical body. I was looking at my own face, pale and lifeless, my eyes shut completely tight. My arms were resting limply at my sides, hooked up to the IV drips that weren't moving. I was staring at my own corpse. The horror that washed over me was indescribable. I felt like my brain was splitting in two. One half of me was still freaking out, trying to protect my baby in the crib, and the other half was just completely losing its mind, realizing that I was literally a ghost, floating in the middle of a hospital room. I was so incredibly light, weightless, untethered from the agonizing pain of my surgery. I kept looking back and forth, looking at my hands gripping the crib, then looking at my dead hands resting on the bed. I spun back around to face the gray woman, but she was completely gone. The space where she had just been standing was empty. Total panic set in. I let go of the crib and desperately tried to yell for my mom again, screaming her name over and over, begging her to wake up and look at me. I managed to get out maybe 3 frantic cries before it happened. It felt like a massive, invisible vacuum had suddenly opened up directly behind me. It wasn't a gentle pull. It was like getting sucked into a jet engine. I felt myself getting yanked backward through the air so damn hard, accompanied by this deafening, rushing sound in my ears, and then, slam. My eyes ripped open, staring straight up at the dark ceiling. Instantly, a tidal wave of excruciating physical agony crashed into me. My lungs felt like they were collapsing as I desperately gasped for air, choking on my own breath. The searing, burning pain of my C-section incision returned 100 times worse, radiating through my entirely paralyzed physical body. But as I lay there, suffocating and thrashing in my own skin, I forced my head to turn toward the door. I needed to know if I had just had a nightmare. I needed to know if I was just hallucinating from the drugs. And right there, illuminated by the faint light bleeding through the frosted glass door, was my baby's crib. It was no longer wedged safely between my bed and the wall. It had been dragged several feet across the room, sitting abandoned right near the entrance, exactly where I had physically fought that woman to get it back. I completely lost my fucking mind. I started hyperventilating, screaming for my mom with a voice that was finally physical and raw. She practically vaulted off her cot, turning on the lights, utterly horrified to see the crib moved. She dragged it back, and I was just sobbing hysterically, pointing at the door, trying to explain that the entity had come back, that it wasn't human. The commotion brought the nurses running in again, and my mom had to frantically call my husband to rush back to the hospital right that second. Eventually, the on-call doctor was summoned. After examining me and seeing my elevated heart rate and chaotic vitals, he calmly wrote it off as a severe case of postpartum psychosis. He explained it away, saying that the trauma of the emergency surgery, combined with the heavy medication, had caused a massive spike in my brainwaves, resulting in intense, hyper-realistic hallucinations and a brief period of shock. He completely dismissed the fact that the heavy crib had moved on its own across the room while my mother slept right next to it. We didn't argue. You learn very quickly that science doesn't have a checkbox for the paranormal. I forced my husband to just straight up quit his job to stay in the room with us, and I refused to let anyone turn off the overhead fluorescent lights for the remainder of our stay. I didn't utter a single word about the gray woman or the fact that I had looked at my own dead body, because I was absolutely terrified that if I acknowledged it out loud, that thing would come back to finish the job. The only logical explanation I can come up with is that the severe exhaustion pushed me into temporary clinical death, making my spirit literally step out of my failing body for a moment. I kept my mouth shut at the hospital, terrified of angering that entity, but the second I walked through my front door, I just lost it and bawled my eyes out for 24 hours. I became so paranoid that I'd hold my baby in a death grip until my mom literally had to pry him away, though, thank God, the fear slowly washed away as he grew up. Back in '92, right after I graduated, I got assigned to the maternity ward at this provincial hospital down south. And man, the facilities were just awful. We didn't have those bright white lights everywhere like you see now. It was all these dim yellow halogen bulbs that made everything look incredibly sickly. I remember the cleaning staff would just do a half-assed job, leaving these faded black bloodstains on the walls that looked absolutely terrifying at night. Because of that, I was terrified of the dark and always begged the head nurse to just let me do the morning shifts, even if it meant clocking in at 4 a.m. Just to give you some context, this place was in Anjiang, right around the Long Suyen area. And honestly, before I really get into the weeds of this, I need to ask a massive favor from anyone listening right now. If any of you are in the medical field, or if you've ever experienced a physical, agonizing pain that you knew deep down didn't belong to your own body, like a spirit literally hijacking your nervous system to make you feel exactly how they died, please drop a comment and let me know. I just need some kind of validation to know I'm not completely losing my mind for believing this is what happened to me. Anyway, let me walk you through how my absolute nightmare actually started. I had only been working at this hospital for about 6 months. I was a total rookie, you know? And there was this senior attending doctor who was basically my mentor. She was in her 40s, incredibly skilled, and someone I looked up to massively. Well, one afternoon, I was literally packing up my bag, getting ready to clock out before the sun set, and she pulled me aside. She practically begged me to cover her night shift. She told me she had this huge family death anniversary the next day, and since she lived alone, she had to be up at 2 a.m. plucking chickens and cooking, so she desperately needed someone to just physically be there to cover her attendance. She swore up and down that I wouldn't have to lift a finger. I could just go straight to the on-call room and sleep the entire night. I really didn't want to. My intuition was screaming at me to say no, but she was my superior, and back then, hospital hierarchy was no joke. I was so desperate to stay on her good side that, like an absolute idiot, I agreed. I went home, took a quick shower, had dinner with my folks, and told my mom I was pulling an all-nighter. She was surprised, but I just brushed it off. By the time I pedaled my bike back to the hospital, it was around 7 p.m. And honestly, the vibe wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it would be at first. There were about 8 of us on duty that night, split into 2 teams. Usually the day shifts were incredibly strict and stressful, with doctors yelling and patients crying, but the night crew was surprisingly chill. We rarely had patients coming in that late, so everyone just gathered around the main nurse's station. We were eating some guava dipped in salt and pepper, peeling fruit, and someone had brought this old beat-up cassette player. We were just sitting there under those sickly yellow lights, listening to late-night storytelling FM radio shows. It was actually really cozy. The static from the radio kind of acted like white noise, and we were just hanging out, shooting the breeze. But then, the clock hit around 1:15 a.m., or maybe closer to 1:30. My memory of the exact minute is blurry, and the exhaustion just slammed into us like a freight train. The hospital got dead silent. The radio was turned off, and almost everyone decided to go catch some sleep in the on-call room. Now, this room was situated right next to the operating theater. They designed it like that so we could sprint over if there was an emergency bleeding out on the table. Usually, during a normal shift, only 2, maybe 3 nurses slept in there at a time, so it felt spacious enough. But that night, for some weird reason, all 6 or 7 of us decided to pile in there at once. The beds were these incredibly old, creaky wooden frames, barely wide enough for 1 person, let alone 2. But since it was so crowded, I had to share a bed with another nurse. Let's call her Harper. Because I was the junior, I took the outside edge. That meant my left shoulder was practically pressed against Harper's back, and my right side was just entirely exposed to the empty aisle of the room. It was uncomfortable. The mattress was basically a rock, and the air was thick and stuffy, but I was so incredibly drained that I figured I could sleep standing up if I had to. I closed my eyes, and within maybe 10 minutes, I started drifting off into that heavy, murky space between being awake and asleep. That's when things took a turn. I was lying there, completely motionless, when I felt something cold just barely brush against the knuckles of my right hand. It wasn't a draft from a window. It felt like actual physical fingers gently tracing my skin. And then I heard a voice. It was this raspy, hollow whisper right by my right ear, just chanting this one word over and over in a weird, rhythmic loop. Come, come, come. Now, in my groggy, half-asleep state, my brain immediately went into denial mode. I thought, okay, Harper must be annoyed that I'm taking up too much space on this tiny bed, and she's trying to wake me up to tell me to move. It's insane how your mind will literally invent any mundane, bullshit excuse to avoid facing a terrifying reality. I was just mildly annoyed. I kept my eyes completely closed and mumbled out loud to Harper, asking her what her freaking problem was, and telling her that she didn't have to literally chase me out of the bed just because it was a tight squeeze. I waited for her to reply or to shove me, but there was just this dead, heavy silence, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I turned my head slightly to the left, toward Harper, and realized she was completely passed out. I could hear her deep, even breathing. Her chest was rising and falling perfectly in sync. And that's when my stomach just completely dropped into my shoes. Because the realization hit me like a physical blow. Harper was on my left, but the freezing touch and that whispering voice, it had come from my right, from the empty aisle. My heart started hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it was going to crack my sternum. I slowly, ever so slowly, turned my head to the right. Standing right there beside the bed was a woman. She was wearing a standard issue, hospital maternity gown. But the thing is, the second my eyes locked onto her, my entire body just shut down. Complete and total sleep paralysis. I tried to shoot up. I tried to scramble backward over Harper, but it felt like someone had poured wet concrete over my chest and pinned my shoulders to the mattress with these impossibly heavy, invisible weights. I couldn't move a single muscle. All I could do was lie there, my eyes wide open, staring at this entity. I tried to scream, to ask her what she was doing in the staff room, but all that came out of my mouth was this pathetic, muffled gurgling sound in the back of my throat. And then, she spoke again, but it didn't sound like it was coming from the air. It sounded like it was vibrating directly inside my own skull. Come deliver it for me. My water broke. It's time. It hurts so much. It hurts. I was just lying there, completely paralyzed, my brain screaming at me that this was absolute bullshit, that it was physically impossible. We didn't have any patients in labor that night. I had been sitting at the reception desk for hours. No one had been admitted. But before my brain could even process the logic of it, she started groaning. It was this deep, guttural, animalistic groaning of a woman in active, agonizing labor. And then, she spread her legs apart. Now, you have to understand something about the maternity gowns in provincial hospitals back in the 90s. Because the hospital was so severely underfunded, the fabric of those gowns was this incredibly cheap, paper-thin cotton. If a woman stood in front of a strong light source, that gown became almost completely translucent. It was practically a sheer veil. The hallway outside our sleep room had these bright emergency lights that were kept on 24/7, and the light was spilling through the open doorway, hitting this woman right from behind. So when she stood there, maybe 3 feet away from the edge of my bed, groaning and clutching her stomach, with her legs spread wide, the fabric pulled tight across her body. It was basically acting like a projector screen, and through that thin, backlit fabric, I saw the silhouette of her lower body. I really want to warn you guys, this next part is incredibly graphic and just deeply fundamentally wrong. I saw, clear as day, a massive dark lump protruding from her lower regions. It was the silhouette of a baby's head, literally crowning, but it wasn't a normal birth. It looked like a shadow puppet show from hell. The head was just jerking from side to side, frantically twisting, practically clawing its way out of her body, ripping through her flesh as she stood there screaming in that silent, echoing way. I was so utterly terrified that my brain just broke. I couldn't look at the silhouette anymore, so my eyes just frantically locked onto this rusted metal screw on the leg of the bed frame next to her. I stared at that single mundane screw with everything I had, hyperfixating on the rust patterns, trying to convince myself I was just having a stress-induced hallucination. But the sounds, God, the sounds wouldn't stop. She just kept pushing and pushing, her hands pressing down violently on her own swollen belly. And then, the baby fully emerged. And honestly, if I had to measure it, the poor thing was tiny, maybe just 2 handspans long, and it dropped. I heard this sickening, wet snapping sound, like a thick guitar string being pulled to its absolute limit, until it completely snaps under the tension with a sharp, sickening thwack. It was the sound of the umbilical cord yanking taut, and then the baby was just dangling there, suspended mid-air between her legs, swinging back and forth, like a fleshy pendulum, just hanging by the cord. I completely lost my fucking mind. I couldn't breathe. My body started convulsing, just shaking violently like I was having a massive seizure on the mattress. Harper, the nurse sleeping next to me, must have felt the wooden bed vibrating. She woke up groggy, turned over, and according to her, she saw me lying flat on my back, my eyes practically bulging out of my skull, staring into the dark corner of the room while trembling so hard my teeth were loudly clacking together. She slapped my arm hard and yelled my name. The exact second her hand made contact with my skin, the paralysis shattered. The invisible weight vanished, and I shot up, throwing my arms around Harper, sobbing hysterically. I was just screaming that I saw a demon, that there was a monster right next to the bed. The other nurses bolted awake in a panic, slamming their hands against the wall to hit the light switch. The old fluorescent tubes flickered on, buzzing loudly, and the room was completely empty. There was no pregnant woman, no baby, no blood, nothing. Just the 6 of us, staring at each other in absolute, breathless terror. I couldn't speak. I literally had to be half carried out into the main reception area. I was sweating through my scrubs, hyperventilating, just aggressively wiping my face with a towel someone handed me. It took me a solid 30 minutes of just sitting there, shaking like a leaf, before I could even form a coherent sentence. When I finally managed to stutter out what I had seen, the translucent gown, the tiny baby dropping, the cord snapping, everyone went dead pale. Some of the older nurses who exclusively worked the night shifts were desperately trying to rationalize it, asking if I was just stressed, saying they had worked that ward for a year and never seen a single weird thing. But then, the old cleaning lady who was mopping the corridor overheard us. She stopped, leaned on her mop handle, and quietly told us something that scared the crap out of me. She had been working at that hospital since the late 1980s when it first opened. She told us that the room we were sleeping in, it wasn't originally designed as an on-call restroom. When the hospital was built, that room was an active delivery room. They had 4 delivery rooms total, but for some sketchy reason, years ago, the administration permanently shut that specific room down, stripped out the medical equipment, and converted it into a staff resting area, even though the hospital was constantly overcrowded and desperately needed the delivery space. She didn't explain further, but honestly, having worked in obstetrics, I knew exactly what that meant. Out in the rural areas of the Mekong Delta, we had a lot of cases of what we called dropped births, women who lived too far away and ended up giving birth in the middle of a boat ride or on a bumpy dirt road before they could reach us. It was incredibly dangerous. Most of the time, the babies didn't survive, and the mothers would hemorrhage to death if they didn't get cut open immediately. My gut just told me that woman had made it to the hospital, made it right into that specific delivery room, and lost her baby and her life in that exact spot. And whatever trauma trapped her there was so intense that they had to board the room up to hide it. The rest of the staff were so freaked out they told me to just go home immediately, promising they would forge my signature on the attendance sheet for the morning. I grabbed my bike and pedaled home in the pitch dark, terrified out of my mind, constantly checking over my shoulder to see if that dangling silhouette was following me. The next morning, the senior doctor who guilted me into taking the shift found out what happened. She pulled me aside, looking incredibly guilty, and apologized profusely. She told me to keep my mouth shut so it wouldn't cause a panic among the pregnant patients, but she assured me she would never, ever ask me to do a night shift again. And from that day on, whenever the night roster was drawn up, they literally crossed my name out. They just accepted that my spirit was too weak for the dark, and I thought that was it. I thought I had learned my lesson, paid my dues, and survived the worst of it. But I was wrong. 2 years later, in 1994, I broke my own rule. By this time, I had gotten a bit more experience under my belt. I wasn't just assisting in the delivery room anymore. I was also managing the recovery rooms where the new mom stayed. My aunt, let's call her Aunt Gemma, was admitted to our hospital to give birth. Now, Aunt Gemma had done a lot for my family when we were struggling financially, and my mom was incredibly loyal to her. So, my mom basically cornered me and laid on the heaviest guilt trip you could imagine. She begged me to take the night shift for the 3 days Aunt Gemma was staying, just so a family member could be there to get her hot water, check her stitches, and make sure the other nurses weren't giving her a hard time. I felt indebted, and it was my own family, so I reluctantly agreed. I swapped my day shifts and told the head nurse I'd be covering the postpartum wing. The first night went completely fine, but the second night, it was an absolute nightmare right from the jump. I was essentially the only nurse actively managing 8 different patient rooms. I was running ragged, boiling water on hot plates, changing IV drips, cleaning umbilical stumps for the newborns, folding gauze. By the time 2 a.m. rolled around, I was physically and mentally exhausted. But it wasn't just normal fatigue. Out of nowhere, I developed this blinding, agonizing headache. I'm not talking about a normal migraine or a lack of caffeine. It felt like someone had shoved a metal spike into my temples and was just slowly twisting it. My vision was blurring, and my head felt so heavy I could barely keep my neck straight. A few of the other nurses saw me violently rubbing my temples and looking like a ghost, and they took pity on me. They told me to go down to the ground floor break room and lie down for a bit, promising they'd listen out for Aunt Gemma and the other patients. Now, this ground floor break room was entirely different from the on-call room upstairs. It wasn't a bedroom. It was just a cold storage area where they kept 4 or 5 empty stainless steel stretchers lined up against the plaster wall. Nurses absolutely weren't allowed to sleep on the stretchers. If management caught you, you'd be heavily reprimanded. So if we wanted to rest, we literally had to flatten out dirty cardboard boxes on the cold tile floor and sleep underneath the stretchers, like dogs. I was in so much pain I didn't even care about the hygiene. I grabbed some cardboard, dragged myself under one of the metal stretchers, and collapsed onto the floor. I didn't even have a pillow. I just stacked my hands together, rested my cheek on my knuckles, and closed my eyes. praying for the throbbing in my skull to stop. The pain was making me dizzy, almost nauseous. I drifted into this murky, feverish sleep. And then, through the haze, I felt someone touch me. I was lying on my side, and I clearly felt two hands gently pry my own hands away from my face and place them down on my chest. Then, these fingers, ice-cold freezing fingers, started rubbing my eyebrows, slowly tracing the tails of my eyebrows and then working their way up to my scalp. They were massaging my head. At first, it felt incredible. The coldness actually numbed the throbbing pain, and the pressure was hitting the exact acupressure points around my temples perfectly. I honestly just thought one of the other nurses had come downstairs, saw me rolling around in pain, and decided to help me out. I just lay there, completely limp, letting them massage my scalp, feeling the tension drain away. But then, the movements started getting faster, more erratic. I felt the cold hands reach around the back of my head and aggressively unclip my hair. Back then, all nurses had to have their hair tightly pinned up in a bun. You would never ever see a nurse with her hair down on duty. The hands violently pulled my clip out, and my long hair spilled all over the dirty cardboard. I was still half asleep, groggy and confused, and I mumbled out loud, "Hey, go easy. You're gonna tangle it, and I don't have a comb down here." The second those words left my mouth, the hands went absolutely feral. They didn't just massage my head anymore. They started violently grabbing handfuls of my hair, scrubbing my scalp like somebody aggressively scouring a greasy, burnt pan. They were tossing my head from side to side, tangling my hair into these massive, painful knots. My eyes felt like they were glued shut with superglue. It took every ounce of willpower I had to force my eyelids open. I tilted my chin up, straining my eyes in the dim light to see who the hell was doing this to me. Squatting right on the floor above my head, right next to the caster wheels of the metal stretcher, was a woman in a vintage nurse's uniform, but it wasn't anyone I knew. I had worked at that hospital for almost 3 years. I knew every single face on every single shift. I had never seen this woman in my life. Her skin was this awful, suffocating shade of pale blue, like she had been starved of oxygen. Her eyes were completely bugged out, staring down at me with this unblinking, psychotic intensity, and her lips were pursed together so tightly they were practically white. She was just glaring at me, her freezing hands buried deep in my hair, violently shaking my head. Adrenaline flooded my system. I screamed in pure terror and tried to scramble backward, trying to sit up to defend myself. But the second I moved, she gripped my hair in both of her fists and violently yanked my head backward, keeping me pinned down. I tried to sit up again. She yanked my hair backward again, jerking my neck. It was just this brutal mechanical rhythm. I would push myself up, and she would violently pull me back down. The pain in my scalp was excruciating. I started screaming at the top of my lungs, "Help me! Somebody help me!" I heard footsteps thundering down the hall. A few of the nurses from the front desk had heard me screaming and came sprinting into the room, slapping the light switch on. The moment the fluorescent lights buzzed to life, I heard this sharp, metallic, clattering sound echoing around the room, and the heavy, suffocating pressure on my head vanished into thin air. But I couldn't sit up. My head was completely stuck to the floor. The nurses rushed over, crouching down next to me, asking me what the hell was going on and why I was screaming like I was being murdered. I was just crying hysterically, pointing at the empty space above me, sobbing that a ghost had attacked me, that a dead nurse was trying to rip my hair out. They told me to calm down and stay perfectly still. When they checked behind my head, they realized why I couldn't move. During the struggle, my long hair had been aggressively twisted and threaded through the caster wheels of the metal stretcher and then wrapped tightly around the rusted iron frame. It was completely, impossibly tangled. It took 3 nurses working together to try and untangle me. They were pulling and yanking, but the knots were so tight and woven so deeply into the mechanism of the wheel that they couldn't get it free. Eventually, after 15 minutes of me crying on the dirty floor, one of them had to go find a pair of surgical scissors. They had to cut a massive chunk of my hair off just to physically free me from the stretcher. For a girl in the 90s, having a huge chunk of your long hair hacked off like that was devastating. I was holding the severed clump of my own hair in my trembling hands, just weeping uncontrollably as they dragged me out of the room and back to the brightly lit reception desk. None of the nurses working that night had any idea what had just happened. They were just as terrified as I was. They let me sit at the desk, shaking and crying, refusing to be left alone until the sun finally came up. A few days later, Aunt Gemma was discharged, and I immediately went back to my day shifts. My horrific headache had completely vanished the moment I left that hospital, the morning after the attack. It never came back. About a week later, an older male doctor pulled me aside in the hallway. He had heard the rumors about what happened to me in the ground floor break room, about my hair getting tangled and the mysterious, blinding headache. He looked at me with this very grim expression and asked if the headache had felt like a sudden, unnatural pressure in my temples. I just nodded. Then he told me the dark history of that room. Back in the late 1980s, when the hospital was severely understaffed and overflowing with patients, the nurses were working themselves to the bone. There was this one young nurse, only in her early 20s. One night, during a particularly grueling shift, she went to this exact doctor and complained of a sudden blinding headache. She said her face was twitching uncontrollably and her limbs felt completely weak. The doctor just assumed it was extreme fatigue and told her to go down to the storage room on the ground floor and lie down on some cardboard to rest. She went down there. An hour later, when they needed her to dispense medication, she didn't answer the intercom. The doctor went down to check on her and found her lying dead on the floor. She had suffered a massive, fatal stroke right there on the cardboard, right next to the stretchers. When he told me that, the puzzle pieces just slammed together in my mind, and I felt physically sick to my stomach. It wasn't just a random ghost attack. That spirit had latched onto me from the very beginning of my shift. That unnatural, agonizing headache wasn't a medical issue, it was her. She was possessing me, forcing me to physically experience the exact symptoms she felt right before she died. She made me feel her stroke. She made me go down to that exact room, lie in that exact spot, and reenact her final, painful moments. She wanted me to suffer the way she did. Looking back, the realization that a spirit can literally hijack your nervous system and force you to feel their fatal pain is something that haunts me to my core. I'm just so grateful I survived it. But seriously, thank you all for listening to me ramble on about this. Stay safe out there and trust your gut if a place feels wrong. That second incident was the final straw for me, and I swore to myself and my family that my graveyard shift days were officially over. I remember looking my mom dead in the eye and telling her that even if she was the one in the hospital bed, she'd have to settle for me visiting in the morning. My nerves just couldn't handle the paranormal baggage that came with the dark, and I wasn't about to tempt fate a third time. To this day, with over 30 years of experience under my belt, my name is still the first one crossed off the night roster.